Welcome to Spiritual Studies Session 67. This session will be overlooking the historical and worldwide expression of both animal and human sacrifice as it relates to spiritual traditions and religiosity. Now, this is a very ambitious subject, very layered. And in the way of explanation, we will find ways to understand the ancient past that we might not anticipate. This is certainly not to condone behaviors, but it is in the interest of understanding our history as people, because as we will see, this is all of our history. So sacrifice appears by historical record in the Middle Paleolithic period. There are pits that have been excavated, burial sites, that seem to indicate offerings. There are these particular arrangement of skulls and the long bones of bears, etc., indicating. Although when it comes to archaeology, that's the best we can have. Indication. The assumption of a kind of ritualistic sacrifice, magical significance and the like, is given by its arrangement in these burial sites, and the fact that what was given was not fully cleaned off. For instance, if a kill was made, then it would be cleaned. However, to give it all, or to give a significant portion of it, would have only been done for a reason of significance. This practice is still happening to some extent, or was only recently stopped to some extent. However, we can date it all the way back into prehistory. It seemed from the beginning that there was a special attention to what animals were sacrificed. And this goes to the specific culture. Might we mention the bear cults? The question of human sacrifice seems much more shifty. We can find in early Mediterranean civilizations that there was some practice of ceremonious sacrifice of women and children and young pigs. Now, interestingly, as it develops, the pigs would be substituted for the humans. These ceremonies have many implications, but better said, many different intentions. But first, we should get back into the mind of the period that we're talking about. So if we look at the art, and if we study the cave paintings, and we study the animistic mindset, as we've done in this course, then we know that there is a kind of interplay between the relationship between what it means to be a human being and what it means to be an animal. The intermixing of the human and animal form. Such is why in religious depictions we often come across chimeric representations, part human, part animal, part animal, so forth. This boundary dissolve between these distinctions warrants a few different names, but it's just to say that the religious experience is that I am no different than the animals that appear. We are both sentient, conscious beings inhabiting bodies on this unknown world. Okay? So this relationship as well is fluid. If we ourselves notice that nature is reciprocal and recursive, then I could just as easily be bear. Last time, next time, 5 times from now. So when it comes to living, though, you need to survive, right? You need to hunt. And you need to take from the plants and from the animals to survive. But if you think of these animals and plants, so forth, as sentient, then you need some forgiveness. you need to right this somehow. And so this is kind of the animism, shamanism way. Whether to meet in respect, to give when you get, so forth. This relationship of the dances, of mimicking animals, of fertility rites, right there. This interchangeability between forms. To think of the guardians, the ancestors, as those that speak through different bodies. If an animal is significant, you have a totemistic experience, that is the guardian moving through the animal. The guardian also moves through people. Spirit unifies all of these bodies. So to maintain this order, to recognize this order, to establish this order, or to restore this order, human beings took toward sacrifice. As it later develops, humans become a part of this. And as it later develops, this becomes to the glory of God or gods. So what is sacrifice? The term, etymologically speaking, is to set apart and to make. That is sacer and fascer. To set it apart. In a more secular and contemporaneous sense, we understand sacrifice as giving something valuable up in order to gain something more valuable. Parents make sacrifices for their children. This talk, obviously, though, is more along the lines of the supernatural, to offer something for the sake of divinity, for something greater than oneself. Religion, therefore, is an act of sacrifice. Religion is seeking the sacred and the holy, the idea of the divine, whatever that is. And oftentimes this spells out in morals, it spells out in participation in sermon or ceremony. However, if we just take even the slightest glimpse across the religious world in any form, we'll see that there is some form of personal sacrifice. Worship speaks to this. Worship is mankind's relationship with the divine, this experiencing of the power. Sacrifice, worship, prayer. This attempt to invite in or to invoke the transcendent through thought, through word, or through action. You see, here it is, the action of this spirituality. So, sacrifice was thought to be a celebration of life, paradoxically. Life is returned to the source. So again, if we're dialing it back to that previous mentality, life springs up life, right? Death creates life. It's a circle. It spins and spins and spins. So death is returning it to source. Life is fed by life. You eat. What did you eat today? Life is fed by life. So the act of sacrifice was to make this, to honor this, or to contribute to the reciprocal quality of the divine flow of things. The killing of the animal in this specific context, in the context of a ceremony, is at times, this isn't a broad explanation, but they are liberated from the body. This is almost Gnostic, and made available to the conjured deity. If we want to make it a little bit more palpable, to pray to God and to say, I want to give up cigarettes, right? I offer this to you. Help me, right? I offer this to you so that we might have a better relationship. To want the deity to receive an offering, what you have to give to show this kind of loyalty. Now, here's the question that I want to get to. Do you deserve everything that's given to you by this world? All these lives of animals consumed, all these plants ripped up, all these minerals taken, so on and so forth. Do you deserve that? That is the question. That is at the source, in my opinion. So let's get in the way of some explanation. So one explanation is that sacrifice was to gift. It was to secure favor with the divine. So I think things are pretty good right now. I make a sacrifice to ensure that things stay good, to offer more than what was necessary. And life is viewed as sacred. So I will offer life as the ultimate gift to the divine. Life is divine. It's living here, but it is divine. So here's the gift. What's interesting is through the historical record, agriculture exponentiated sacrifice. So there were some sites in the previous days, yes, but when it comes to the wholesale, when it comes to the traditions of such, and when it comes to specifically more of the human sacrifice element, it comes with agriculture. And that's interesting, because then life depends on the feasibility of the crop. And the land, she's fickle. And so what, if anything, can we do to help ensure that we'll be okay here? Because we chose to stay just here. Now, that's agriculture, baby. So we really need to bet. If the divine also, by our beliefs, killed themselves, gave themselves to death in order to become all the living plants and all the living creatures of the world, then we understand that's a big deal. And we want to honor that because we benefit from that. We live because of that. Thus, we recreate this happening that the divine gave their body for. And we set on a tradition of honoring this sacrifice they made by making sacrifices to them to keep alive the memory of what was done. So this act restores that order, you see? Now, when it comes to humans, though, this is a kind of more, it is viewed as a higher sacrifice. Depending on the cultures, then they are choosing. They are choosing and thus more powerful to the divine. And thus they are including themselves in the beginning. They are including themselves as the creator did and honoring in the way that the creator did. That sounds like fulfillment. And again, I'm not condoning. My job with this whole course is to explain. Okay. All right. And we're going to move. We're going to move a lot. So stick with me. So this is a repetition of the primordial act. So this is one explanation. The reenactment of creation as one explanation. We want the crops to stay good, so we do what was done that made the crops good. And then there is the rebirth sacrifice. And we saw this strongly with the Apis bull, that is the embodiment of Ptah, the creator of the Egyptian cosmology. So this is to say that the creator deity is embodied somewhere on the earth with Apis. And we are going to ensure that that creator doesn't suffer old age. And thus, we are going to kill, but in the best way, the creator, so that they may be reborn and forever youthful, since they are immortal. It's a spirit. It's beyond body. So this is the rejuvenation of the deity, which is honoring the experience of the deity. Now, if this wasn't directly done, then it is symbolically done through ceremony. But in other cases, if we have a tribe and our king or our chief is growing old, the king would oftentimes be killed and replaced with a more vigorous chief. And this was viewed as euthanasia. This was viewed as mercy, to save from decay. Rejuvenation. Micro, macro, as above, so below. So this is another explanation, the rejuvenation explanation. Then there is the karmic explanation. And we already kind of touched on this, but I want to point out the term scapegoat. And in this case, we recognize our people have done a lot of bad stuff. We have suffered a lot of impurity. We are not as we should be. And in order to restore the order and to restore peace, we will acquire a scapegoat. So this person isn't necessarily at fault, or in this case, goat isn't at fault, but they will voluntarily or involuntarily, based on the historical record, embody the fault, blame of the community. And so their sacrifice is horribly grateful. I mean, man. And so this is a reconciliation, and this karma, you see, this guilt, the belief that it can be taken in by a person, or at least symbolically taken in by a person, to help placate the minds of the people, to offer up the scapegoat, to transfer that energy over to them and to have them send it. Man. This gift, the idea of giving this gift, this sacrifice, this acknowledgement of negative karma, invites pity from the god, invites a gift in return from the god, just invites, in the relationship with the divine, it invites a better circumstance. The world is viewed as energic. Sacrifice was also done for forgiveness. If we live in a place that has a bunch of natural disaster, if we live in a place that has a predisposition to calamity, or we suffer things that seem more pointed, like pestilence, or drought, or famine, then it seems that we have gotten out of the natural order. And we need to be like, we want to do anything we can to be forgiven for this. And so thus, in our communication with the divine, there's one way that we know. There is also the case of the ancient Greeks, and in that case, it is it's not the only thing they did, but there were sacrifices for victory. To sacrifice to Artemis, to Zeus, to Athena for victory in a battle. Paying that budget ahead of time, so to speak, to earn the favor of the gods. And then there is the case of sacrificing for loyalty to royalty, and in which case we can look at the Bible and the sacrifice of the only child to Yahweh, which, you guys know that story. I don't need to say how, no spoilers there. A sacrifice. Show it. Show what you're willing to give. Show your devotion. Action. There is also this case of using sacrifice as a means to meet death on your own terms. If you have, again, I'm not suggesting any of this. I'm saying in the Vedic traditions, I'm saying the initiations would go forward, and you're making your way to it. And in this case of moving towards sacrifice, to reach yourself into a place to be just right, to move on to the sacred world, bathing, fasting, solitude, prayer, to meet it on your own devices as a vessel. To be, from the individual level, this is an excuse for you to grow closer to the divine in life and to honor the divine in death. That speaks to the voluntary. Sacrifice often, it's the ancient world, and it was often patriarchal as well. When it came to who would do it, it was oftentimes the men. Not just in the way of giving their lives, but also in the way of initiating the sacrifices. And not to mention, too, that sacrifices were also quite to the hands of the priests. And there are some interesting cases where this isn't the case. Like in ancient China, there was a priesthood, but the sacrifices were always by the head of the family, which was the dude. And then in ancient Egypt, there was a priesthood, but all sacrifices were to be made by the pharaoh. There's also the cases of their building sacrifices, mortuary sacrifices, and communion sacrifices. And so all of these, there are many different occasions to do so. And so I want to take a little bit also and just mention this idea of priesthood. Because the priest, what are they doing? They would have lived what would have been, say, a normal life. And in this case, they are choosing to give up certain key aspects of their personhood in order to follow the divine. Here it is again, the more abstract practice of sacrifice through what it means to be a priest. So since that one has sacrificed, that one ought to run the sacrifice. The priest's function was the obvious person for sacrificial ceremonies. The idea, too, in the internalized spirituality, through the thought and through the word and through commitment, then it comes to bear the belief that since you give up so much and since you've put in so much work, then you reach Buddhahood, or then you reach gnosis, or then you reach wokeness, right? Enlightenment. This is the idea. You don't get it for free. You gotta do the mantras. You gotta take the voyages. You gotta do and sacrifice your wealth. Anyway, returning to the point. So, blood also has a big part of this. And when we're talking about magic later in the course, this is going to become very pertinent because blood is thought of as divinity. It's thought of as the life itself. If it's pumping through you like that, then it's clearly the main function. You know, it's what's making it happen. And so this is a very powerful allegory, or blood has very powerful symbolic use. It is registered by the divine, thus the letting of blood. And this letting was not just in the case of the human, but also the animal. And when it comes to refocusing on the animal as well, based on what I said before, certain cultures have certain value towards animals, certain animals more than others. So when it comes to the animals that have most often been killed for the sake of ceremonious ritual, it is the goat, the ram, the bull, the ox, and the horse. In the Greek days, they could also kill birds. They also would sacrifice fish. It's interesting too because you have the bull as a real ubiquitous thing because Indra was the bull, and oh gosh, I don't want to go down that lane. The bull of heaven, thus the sacrifice. The sacrifice, since it's the bull of heaven, will sacrifice the bull to heaven. The ancient Greeks also wanted to sacrifice darker animals to the underworld. They would want to sacrifice the fastest of horses to the sun god Helios by the same logic. They would want to sacrifice dogs to Hecate, since Hecate traveled with dogs. The symbolic animal would be the symbolic animal. The Syrians would sacrifice fish because they wanted to secure the favor of the ocean and sea and water deity. Since the sea deity creates these things and likes these things, you like these things, right? Here you go. The bull, as it was ubiquitous, mentioned before, because of Indra, because of the Greek bull of the earth, Zeus Kethanos, and thus the Norse god Freyr. All bulls. And, I mentioned right before, that was the Apis bull. It was viewed as the most foundational to the earth. And since this all started with the idea of fertility, the bull itself is thought of as both the keeper of fertility and the giver of death. That thing could murk you super easy, and it inseminates super easy. So it was a very notable thing to give. Now, when it comes to transitioning slightly into the idea of the human sacrifice once more, this, yet again, could be used for fertility purposes, in earth fertility. If we're giving things to make the earth good, then again, the human would be most pertinent, most valuable. And again, all these things are being sacrificed because of their perceived value. And if we as mankind prioritize ourselves more than the rest, depending on what culture we're in, that is going to mean more. So you can see how the culture affects sacrifice. So there is the case of death for royalty. And you see in Peru that women were strangled as servants for the chief, or I don't know what to call them. In ancient China, the kings would be, or the servants of the kings would be buried with them to serve them in the afterlife or to honor their life. The sacrifice in respect and awe to the mana or the status of the individual. In China, this seemed to have taken its ultimate peak with the number of people that would be sacrificed or would give their life to die with the emperor. The Shang dynasty was the biggest time for this. Not just people, but animals, littered graves, sacrificial tombs, various types of religious sacrifices, a long ordeal to honor the king. So, oftentimes, if you're in the ancient world and you would serve somebody for so long, it would seem natural that since you hold them so highly, that you would give life like they had given life. You go with them. And since we most strongly believe in the continuity of life into the afterlife, this is just like one harsh time, move into the next era. And we honor that loyalty. So it seems in these cases, this sort of explanation was more voluntary. But we do see how this would change. Like, for instance, in Egypt, there are indications with the pharaoh's servants being killed with their master. Well, killed in honor to be sacrificed after the death of the pharaoh, you see, to serve them. But in time, this seemed to wane away, and it gave way to symbolic figures being buried instead. So we'll create an artifice of you as a person and give that to the grave instead of your genuine person. Now, the forms of these deaths are another thing. So the ascendancy idea, which is death by fire. So if you were to be killed by fire and sacrifice, then this idea would be to ascend. You are moving towards the gods of the heavens. Agni was the deity of the Vedic religion, still present but more popular back when, and would bring offerings to the gods. So thus, fire brings offerings to the god. Fire is sacred. This is a vehicle. Fire was thought to be a vehicle toward the celestial deities. This ritual burning would not just be, it could be human, it could be animal, and it can be like incense, vegetation. And so it depends. The Babylonians did this. Judaism did this, but in that case it's animals and vegetation, ritual burning. The ancient Greeks' word for sacrifice of itself means to burn and to smoke. So sacrifice has a big trope with fire, and thus when we see like depictions in popular media of this, we're used to seeing fire, and I guess that's no accident. But there is also the case of the earth, the death by earth, and thus if we want to please the chthonic deities, the underworld deities, this sacrifice would be done by burial, and not necessarily dead. But these sacrifices were more often done for fertility. In West Africa, we see the burying of fowls and yams, and this was to promote fertility. In Greece, we saw this one in the same way, to be buried in a trench or to be whatever was sacrificed above ground and would be buried very deeply. Probably for Persephone. I would think for Persephone, actually. And then there's by water. And in this case, we see that in the Mayan world, young people, young women were drowned in sacred wells. The ancient Greeks and ancient Vedic cults would sacrifice by drowning in sacred lakes and in rivers. And the Norse would cast people off of cliffs into wells, cast them into waterfalls. And the Baltic people would do this as well. These were always sacred grounds, and as we saw in the course 2, the root term for the word soul, sao, was thought to be etymologically tied to meaning of the waters. So to think of the water as the unifier of life, that blood is ultimately constituted by water. We need to drink water to survive. Water as the home of the soul. and thus to be given to the water, especially the sacred water, would be a reunification with the source. So we're going to go through a number of examples here. In what the popular culture remembers or thinks of most when it comes to human sacrifices are the Mesoamerican sacrifices. And so in which case we should acknowledge that, because honestly we haven't talked about the Incas and the Aztecs a lot. We talked about the Olmecs some. In this case, the Inca civilization was very prone to the natural disasters, and thus we already understand where this is going. The natural disasters were earthquakes and volcanoes and floods, and so in which case we need to either, one, be forgiven, or two, restore the order. And so in this case, it was thought to bring an end to these natural disasters, but they keep happening. So at first, these sacrifices, in order to satiate these disasters from happening, were exclusively prisoners of war. But since they didn't stop, then entropy starts to kick in. And so then they start to use their own, and then they start to use young people. And so the more innocent, the more pleasing to the gods. And see, if these gods are going to throw calamity, then they're quite cruel. So you have to give a lot to quiet them. You see, this is a relationship with the nature that surrounds you. So eventually this got so far that people were born exclusively to later be sacrificed. And this might seem additionally cruel to think that you are born to be sacrificed. But what about that steak you just ate? What about the bacon? What about the eggs for breakfast? To be exclusively born to be slaughtered? Interesting. Now, I'm not going to give a moralistic thing here, but I just think that's interesting. So, that is that case. This is the satiation of the calamity that naturally surrounds the living space. And when it comes to the Aztecs, this is more localized. And what I mean is that it's all about the sun deity, which is the primary default deity. Blood was seen as the sacred life force, and that the sun needs life force to give what it's giving to the world. It needs to be replenished. Otherwise, this is all gone. And we saw this kind of with the Egyptians. I mean, they had a bit of this too, but not exactly like this. So, in order to keep the sun going, there needs to be sacrifice. And the more sacrifices, the longer it will keep going. And so, prisoners of war, which again, we'll get to that later. Then more, right? Then more, then more, then more. Ritual sacrifices that were quite brutal. And I'm not going into details because this isn't like a horror podcast or something. But as we know, the hearts were taken and reserved for another religious ceremony. So there are ceremonies within ceremonies when it comes to this. There are some really big numbers when it comes to how many. There is one record that shows 80,400 people in 4 days were killed for the sun. Which would suggest that there are hundreds of thousands of sacrifices for the sake of the sun each year. And so, I mean, is that like a bank account? I think where it just keeps growing. And so the more you have, the longer it will take to be depleted. So you're really doing quite the service to the future. Oh, man. Interestingly enough, the Slavic, and this is, a lot of these are scattered accounts, but the Slavic also would have prisoners of war sacrificed to the sun deity, which is Perun. So that's not completely unique, but the extent is unique. An interesting case is when we look at Carthage. Carthage did a lot of child sacrifice, and they were very young. And this happening is not necessarily thought of as religious, because there could have been other reasons for, and this applies to all, but there could have been other reasons for this happening. One, the control of overpopulation. So while we've been thinking about all of this for a religious, ceremonious, and divine, reciprocal, karmic, so forth intention, in this case it could be, or in other cases, it could be that this is population control. And if you have only set amount of resources to continue and people keep making people, then by the rulers, there has to be something done to thin the herd a little bit, which could be given under the guise of the idea of sacrifice. You also had a number of really rich people. And if these really rich people kept making more kids, then the chance of their bloodline maintaining that wealth would get thinner and thinner. And so to control the dynasty of the idea of a family line, you might just give way to infanticide, especially if it is culturally approved. So there might be a few more hairs in the pudding, as they say. There might be a bit more to this than is immediately met, but let's continue. Tibet, there are cases of human sacrifice prior to Buddhism, and in which case there is excavation of bodies being buried in the cornerstones of houses to give yourself, or to be given a self to the house in order for its constitution, again, spiritually, energetically, to be substantiated by the person's beingness. Might this also explain the tremendous amount of skulls inside of the Great Wall? The Americas also, the Mississippian culture, suggestions of mass sacrificial burials, and in which case there are too many, and the indications of not being dead when buried, and the indications of how they are laid out, much like the those Paleolithic sites mentioned at the beginning. Unmentioned civilizations that also have indications, if not outright involvement in this discussion. The Israelites, although to some extent questionable, Moloch is the question there, which we've done plenty of that in the course. The Canary Islands, the Hawaiians, the Etruscans, and the Celts. Questionable on the Celts. That could be a smear campaign, much like with the Moloch reference before, just making the point of the ubiquity of all of this. But provided another hair in the pudding, as I said, I don't even know if that is a thing. I'm just going to keep using it. Provided all this, we can question when perceived sacrifices in the ancient past are actually simply the murdering of prisoners of war, as opposed to the idea of, incentivized relationship with the divine. At which case, if there are a great number of prisoners of war, and we want a reason to get rid of them that also is to the benefit of the community with the divine, and also if you just simply wanted to get rid of people, so let's take a different look now. Leviticus 16:5. He shall take from the congregation of the sons of Israel 2 male goats for a sin offering and 1 ram for a burnt offering. This is one of many Old Testament quotes, and some conflatedness about the New Testament that calls for sacrifice. And when it comes to Jesus, sacrifice? Sacrifice? A certain quote would be to say that this was the great and last sacrifice. You see, the sacrifice that overwhelmingly satiated a kind of karmic debt. I don't want to step too far. Okay. There is something to say about the ancient world having a universal understanding of the action towards divinity. No matter where we might look, this transaction between the divine and the mundane is understood in the ancient world. Which few things, provided all the different languages, provided all the different culture, we can't understand each other verbally, but an action like that, that's understood. So it's an interesting communal attribute to that. When it comes to the end, though, like, why did this end? Because this is a wildfire, man. So ingrained in the world. And this is a way of going about. This is just what you do. It's like taxes. It's Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday. It's just the way it is. To think this could never change. It's just how it goes. It's amazing that it just stopped. I mean, eventually. The dissolving of this. And who takes the cake? How? And a lot of the convention around this conversation of how it stops is Christians. Rather, Christianization. That since Christianization took over so many of these lawless places, civilization through Rome, that's why it stopped. But, no. It's never that simple. It's never that simple. The early Christians did not reject animal sacrifice. They simply just didn't have a place to do it. They were the outcasts. They had no means. Being a countercultural, fanatic group in the beginning, they didn't have a means to do so. They were outcasts. They were poor. They didn't have the place. The temple had been ruined. And as we saw already in the course, the Christians needed to make themselves unique. They needed to be other than Judaism. And so we saw this in their strange take on astrology. But this would likewise be done with the 86 any form of sacrifice, which in the dialogue of what Jesus did as it developed, this could be viewed as the great sacrifice. Done. It's over. So, in order to stand out, they disentangled themselves from this. And the Jews weren't far behind them either. Which again, the Jews with the animal sacrifice there is. Questioned Moloch before in the Canaanites. But, the Jews weren't far behind them in this regard of stepping away from sacrifice. But the people would always treat them as though they were obsessed with sacrifice for centuries to come. So, what actually stopped it then? Was it the Christians? Was it the Jews? I mean, we saw in Tibet, it was the Buddhists, right? Before the Buddhists showed up, Tibet was doing sacrifice. So was it the Buddhists? My stake in the ground here, that might not, anyway, is that this is a slow move towards the internalization of spirituality. I distinguished it at the beginning, which was the thought, the word, and the action. And sacrifice came to embody the action of spirituality, the display, the willingness of spirituality. Now, if we move this instead, that action towards internalizing action, as opposed to external action, and involving other beings, be it animal, be it human. This slow move towards spirituality doing what also Hinduism would do. Hinduism, not far from this time, would move into the yogic era, where the practice of spirituality became sophisticated, thus yoga, amongst many other things. To move it inward, that the alchemical stone was not a stone to behold. It was something internal. This seems like, no matter what subject we're talking about, this is the history of thought. This is the history of spirituality. This is when this moves inward. And so by this shifting of mind, the dissolve of sacrifice across the world, slowly. And there is something to say with the Christianization, conquering, absolute overtaking of cultures. But we shouldn't give credit to that, because it's not the story in my opinion, or my take. So, to get back a little bit, let's scope out even further. Again, this idea of sacrifice now is more abstract, and it always has been. But this is the idea of somebody who follows something, that follows a tradition, that follows the divine, that follows some religion. Sacrifice your time, desires, possessions, status, romantic interests in pursuit of the divine. This is the exchange. William James said, the impulse to sacrifice is the main religious phenomena. Prominent, universal, lies deeper than any special creed. If we take the example of marriage, for instance, as a commitment and as a sacrifice, you sacrifice other romantic interests, and you sacrifice these certain aspects of life that involve an independent single nature. This is now a sacrifice that you gave for the exchange of marriage, commitment, and having somebody there that gives you some degree of certainty, right? This idea, though, at its core, just as an example there is this idea of self-sacrifice in there, that you're giving up something. And this is against the individualism. You want to serve something beyond yourself. This is becoming less and less popular. And what I mean is, in the globalization of culture at this point, and especially as exponentiated in Western culture, hedonism, individualism, secular, immediate gratification. The idea of self-sacrifice for other is on the down, man. And so religiousness, accordingly, also is on the down, man. Because what would you do? I mean, you give up for religion. I'll stop drinking so much. I'll stop smoking cigarettes. I don't watch so much TV in service of what? In service of what? To lose the divine, to sacrifice to, and to gain individuality as the supreme, the self with a capital S. Now, this is not me preaching. I'm just saying this mentality of seeking selfdom, of individuating, moves away from sacrifice as it was. Usually before, you would be so willing to give up everything. in service to the divine, as I explained it before. Or people taking each other and making them do that. I mean, that's messy. But the point being is that this idea is far away from us now. Like, so far. We're so far away. That even to the point where abstract sacrifice is, it's waning. It's waning a lot. You know, to see the dissolve of the institutions that necessitate some degree of sacrifice. I mean, even when it comes to the modern labor market and people not wishing to take 40-hour work weeks to serve, to sacrifice for the idea of like this divine corporation. It's waning, man. It's waning. And I don't know how I got there, right? I was researching all this murder, death, but that just became very apparent to me. That all of this really, this has all been a study. I've given you all this information and context and explanation and humanization of these, our past here, but this is where it is. It's all about how we think about it. It's all about the culture. It's all about what is allowed and what's not allowed and what's valued and what isn't valued. If we value the natural order of things, then, you know, if the world and we are betting on the gift of the land exclusively where we are and want to reciprocate the respect of that giving, then that all seemed to naturally bubble up. And so you might care to say that this degree of sacrifice that we still see in the modern world, i.e. sacrifice yourself for the corporation, so forth, is an extension of this givingness as it was hardwired into us over, what, 30,000 years or something? I'm spinning my wheels at this point. I just want to say that this was a very trying subject. Included a lot of cross references, and I have all of the works cited below.